And let us know in the chat if there's any audio issues or something weird's happening so we can fix that. We've been having issues lately. And thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. So we are going to do our best to answer questions that we see posted. If we can get them to go live. Excuse me, I'm just going to check this out on my phone.
And this is just going to be a really, casual conversation about what's been happening over the past year. We kind of all knew that a new funding formula had passed in the 2019 session. There's been a commission that's been meeting for the past year, making a variety of decisions, largely technical decisions, but they're kind of getting to the meat and potatoes right now. So it's a really good time to start updating folks and getting folks involved in that. And then it's also, we're right around the corner from the legislative session. So we really wanted to let folks know, kind of what might be a hot button issue and how the commission's work kind of intertwines with what's going to happen next session. So hopefully this is helpful. It'll be really casual. If you have questions, throw it in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and get started. I am having a little bit of trouble viewing the comments, but maybe they'll pop up in a bit. But lots to discuss, and we're going to try our best to wait to answer questions at the end unless we can go ahead and answer them while we're discussing. So who we are, my name is Michelle Booth. I'm the Communications Director for Educate Nevada Now.
Oh. Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan. I'm the Executive Director of Educate Nevada Now. I'm trying to pull it up too, so maybe I can see the comments, but
Amanda, can you talk a little bit about ENN?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're an organization that formed about 5 years ago. We're a part of the Rogers Foundation. We do all kinds of stuff. It's pretty much all related to fair and equitable funding, adequate funding for our public schools, ensuring every student has the resources they need to be successful. We do a lot of work on the communications front, the data analysis front, litigation and legislative advocacy. So what we've done in the past, for example, is we filed a lawsuit against the Education Savings Account bill that transferred funds from public schools to private schools for the use of vouchers. We challenged that in court and won that case. And right now we're representing an amazing group of parents that are challenging the constitutionality of our current public education system. Are our lawmakers and our state, are they providing the resources necessary for students to meet all of those academic standards and requirements and graduation requirements that are expected of them? So we're really excited to be doing that right now. It's a long road. We're just beginning that journey, but we're excited to be representing these amazing parents.
Right. So you did talk about the lawsuit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the Commission on School Funding, I know we've had a lot going on. This has been a really crazy year, unexpected for all of us. But we, and many of you parents have probably, parents, community members, students and educators have heard about the Commission on School Funding. You kind of know it's important, but there's been a lot going on, right, in all of our lives. So the purpose of this is just to kind of give you all background as to what the progress is of the Commission, and, let you know, what they've done, what they have yet to do, some of the maybe issues that are still somewhat pending. And we're going to try to keep it very, like low level, easy to understand, but it is very complicated. It's extremely complex. So don't worry if you're not understanding anything. You're here now, and that's exciting. This is the beginning if you haven't started, getting into the weeds of it, but you're here now, and we're glad that you're here. And we're going to do our best to explain everything as easy as possible. SB 543, it's the new funding formula, if you will, which is why we have this commission. Amanda, can you give us a little bit of background on SB 543?
Yeah, so SB 543 passed in the 2019 session. It was really supposed to be the modernization of our funding formula. We talked like ad nauseum about how horrible our old formula was, the Nevada plan. It was developed in 1967. It wasn't horrible when it was developed. It was actually worked really well for that time, but a lot has changed in Nevada over the past 50 years. And we really needed a formula that reflected those changes. For example, our demographic changes. We have a lot of students that have unique needs that weren't addressed at all in the old formula. Our formula was incredibly complicated. It was kind of 50 years of patchwork of different programs. And I think there's 80 different sources of funding that went into the Nevada plan at various levels, lots of grants, lots of categorical programs. So it's just a really complex system that didn't meet the needs of our state anymore. So we had advocated pretty hard for a new funding formula. We wanted something that was obviously more transparent, that was, we could hold the state more accountable, we could hold districts more accountable for funding. And we really wanted, weights to serve the needs of all students. Right now, about 20% of students with unique needs like that are at risk or English learner are receiving state funding. So we felt that it was really important to make sure there was enough funding going to every single student that had those needs. And the way that they had done it in 543 is not only are they providing weights, but they're drilling down those weights to the school level. So a school will receive weighted funding based on how many students are enrolled in their school that are English learner at risk. And there's pluses and minuses to that. That's not something we necessarily advocated for, but that's how the formula was written. So the formula in a lot of ways accomplished a lot of the things we were hoping it would accomplish. One of the big sticking points for us was we wanted a formula that was cost-based. So we wanted a formula that bore some relationship to the resources necessary for students to be successful. So does the formula actually account for that, for the needs of students? We didn't quite get there with 543. I'd say that they really didn't want to go there. They didn't want to put in sort of, targets for funding or targets for resources that we were hoping for. We had looked at formulas across the country, trying to find model formulas that we could mimic here in Nevada. And a lot of the really successful formulas did it that way. But they didn't go that far here, but they did create a commission that arguably does do some of those things.
And just a little bit of background. So weights, it's a multiplier. So you've got your, let's say, just throwing a number out there, $5,000 per student that every student gets. But a kid with unique needs, which are ELL, at risk, special ed, and gifted and talented students, get that like a 0.5, right? So they get 2,500 if they get a 0.5 additional dollars. And that goes towards, resources for that student. And so that's a little bit, lots of states had something similar. What we have, and you've heard about it, the Zoom and Victory schools. So we have something that's just at a specific school, but not something that serves all students. So the way it stands right now is if you're an EL or at-risk student and you go to Zoom or Victory school, you're getting all kinds of resources to help you get to where you need to be. And we've seen great results from those schools. But unfortunately, if you don't go to one of those schools, you don't get anything, even if you are an EL or at-risk student. And obviously, this should not be about luck. It should be about every student getting the resources they need. And so that's a little bit about what weights is. And so we're really excited that this formula does have a weighted program. Lots of states in the country do. And so we're moving forward with that. TB, we're getting get into that discussion a little bit more later, but that's one of the really great things that it did. And the funding formula was just passed last session, and it was all thanks to the advocacy from parent groups and educator groups. People didn't know, right? It's this complicated, weird thing that you hear about, but we're finding out that that was the root of a lot of the issues in funding. So we were able to change that thanks to everybody, thanks to all of you. And so that's an example of you're here and you're wanting to get involved or you've been involved, this is just a continuation of what we've done.
Yeah. And, with the formula, I think it was a critical first step to have a modern formula. But I really want to let folks know that this does not mean that, when the formula gets implemented this year, that all of a sudden you're going to have the resources you need at your school. Like, oh, this magically worked. I mean, really at its core, and one of the fundamental issues we had with its passage was it's just a reshuffling of existing dollars. And I saw a great comment when we posted the Facebook invite. Somebody in the comment said like, well, formula is great, but isn't it really about the dollars? Like, don't we really need funding? And that's absolutely true. I think the problem before is a lot of folks thought, well, the system's so unfair, the way funds are distributed is so unfair that I don't want to really, advocate for additional funding because it's going to go somewhere it doesn't need to go, or it's not going to go where it's needed. So I think in a lot of ways, this formula kind of nips that in the bud. We're going to have a formula that's considered a little bit more fair, distribute funds to the state in a way that we can kind of all live with, even though there are some issues that we're still trying to work out. But I think at its core, it's a good thing, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, definitely. And so let's talk about, basically summarize kind of what it does do in a nutshell. It creates transparency. We have a new bucket of funding specifically for K-12 education, so we can see the money, which we couldn't before. Even CFOs at school districts could tell you, like, I'm not even sure how it spits it out, right? So now we are actually able to see what funds go into education and what comes out. And so it's a lot more transparent. It creates the commission that we talked about, and it creates weights. And what it doesn't do, in a nutshell, it doesn't set benchmarks for funding, unlike other states that have those benchmarks to say, like, this is our goal and we're going to get here in 5 years and here in 10 years. And so unfortunately, the formula doesn't have that. It doesn't guarantee that funding will increase with economic growth. Unfortunately, that's the plan, but there's no guarantee in the bill. And it's not based on previous funding studies, so it's not cost-based. So it's kind of like Amanda was saying, just a large reshuffling of funds. And so what I'm going to try to do here, bear with me, I'm going to try to add infographics into the comment section. Hopefully you can see them. So that's what I'm going to try to do.
And I'll talk a little bit about the commission. I think that some of the fundamental issues we had with how the formula was written, in large part, can be solved, or at least pushed in the right direction by the commission's work. The commission will be talking about, and we're going to go into this more in depth later, but we'll be talking about what's the appropriate target of funding. How do we get to those funding levels? How do we make this more fair? And they're also discussing a lot of technical issues that have been really boring to watch, but have been really important about, how do we determine wage differences between districts so we can distribute funds fairly? What do we do about transportation and all these other costs? So, and I think probably one of the biggest, critical parts of this is the commission isn't going away. One of the big problems with the old formula is that, maybe we would revisit it every 10 years and kind of trim around the edges and try to fix little things with it. But there really wasn't the oversight that was needed. There wasn't the communication between the state and the districts on kind of what's happening on the ground and how that affects budget. So I actually am really excited that this commission's ongoing. It's 11 members. Some of them are district CFOs. Some are just financial experts, some are community members. I think it's a really smart group of folks that, truly care about the outcome. I think their recommendations are going to be really important. I'd say probably the thing that kind of keeps me up at night is how much is the legislature going to take to heart their recommendations? Are they actually going to be implemented? So that requires the work of the community to be active during the legislative session. But I think a lot of the work they're doing is really important. And they've actually already made some official recommendations to the legislature. And we wanted to talk a little bit about those, at least the ones that I think that are the most consequential. So one of the things that they're recommending is kind of redefining or finding a new metric or new way to define who's at risk. At risk will come with a weight that we talked about. And every student that's defined as at risk will get that weight. All across
For reference, at risk is like the students who go to victory schools, that's kind of the at risk, right? So
that's kind of serving like a high needs school that has a lot of students who are considered at risk. But that in a way, kind of victory schools are kind of like that. Typically in other states, at risk is or I should say free and reduced lunch eligibility is a proxy for at risk. So you would look at those eligibility levels. They're kind of a little bit more easier to ascertain. It helps kind of do cross comparisons with other states. There's a lot of benefits to using free and reduced lunch eligibility as kind of the marker. So if you're eligible, you're considered at risk, you would receive the weight.
And just about
That's
every state does it that way. They use FRL to define at risk.
And there's some states that are kind of toying with different methods because, some states are doing, and I always forget the name of the program, but they're going to basically say an entire school is eligible. So then at that point, you're not really counting individual students. So there's some, very little variation, but for the most part, FRL has been the proxy for at risk. So the commission really wants to reevaluate that. And that's pretty novel. We'll be one of the few states that are really kind of digging into this with the intent to find a new way to define at risk. There's positives to that and potential negatives. I think the positive, and what we heard a lot in the commission meetings, was that FRL number, even though it's incredibly high here in Nevada, it might actually be under inclusive. There's a lot of students that really drop off eligibility. They no longer are seeking eligibility once they reach high school. And there might be some stigma issues with that, or other things. So there's, in a lot of ways, it might not really reflect students who are in need. It might not reflect other factors that may not be income based.
Yes, you might have, some issues at home that now make you at risk, but you're not somebody who's eligible for FRL, and so you're not going to get those additional services because you're not technically considered at risk per the FRL standards.
Exactly.
So it definitely gives us a lot of bandwidth, but at the same time, there could be some issues with it because they might say they can then decide, hey, we have all these categories that we can use to define at risk, and we're not going to do FRL. At the moment, we would define it as here are all the kids that get free and reduced lunch, but we might minimize that by 20%, 30%. We don't really know. And there'll be less students benefiting. So that's still something that's TBD. They've discussed it, and it's something that they're still going to define. And we're watching for that. We're waiting for that conversation. They've had a lot of conversations about that, but haven't actually made a recommendation as to how they're going to define at risk.
So their only official recommendations is TBD. We want to define it. We want to explore this. And I think they actually push it to the state board to actually start having those discussions. Like the state board needs to, start thinking about what is a good alternative measure. What our big fear is that it's going to be kind of used as a way to say like, oh, we don't like that 50 or 60% of students in this district are eligible. How can we kind of winnow that number down so we're not, expending as much funding? There might be an opportunity for kind of really, high risk, high concentrations of poverty, maybe have a different weight, but to just simply exclude students because it's overwhelming that there's so many students in need, that would be problematic. So we'll be monitoring that. And you might even hear about that at state board meetings or at the legislature, so you kind of have an idea of what they're talking about. Another recommendation is kind of more of a technical one, but accounting for special education funds outside of, or at least the maintenance of effort special education funds and federal funds outside of kind of the typical weight. So it's kind of having its own separate account in the state education fund and dispersed to districts separately. Kind of technical reasons for it. Maintenance of effort is essentially a district's requirement to expend at least the same amount of funds on special education services as they had the year before. So there's a little worry about, we're kind of slowly transitioning into weights. We've been doing that even before this bill, transitioning into weights for special education students. And the worry is that, if the weight doesn't really cover the true cost, to meet the maintenance of effort, general fund dollars will have to cover it. Or if the weight, over, kind of shoots over the target of maintenance of effort, districts will be required to kind of maintain that higher level. So it's kind of technical, but you might hear about maintenance of effort. You might see down the road that the special education weight is treated differently than other weights when you look at things. So that's why that is.
And just for a little bit of reference, right now, school districts, as a state, the school districts are supporting more than 200 million out of their general budget to support the funding that they don't get for special ed. Special ed is supposed to be federal funding that they get, but it's never enough. And that's common across the country. I don't know of any state that says that they're getting enough funding. And there's also the problem that you don't really know, you have to provide the services for every special ed student. And so there might be a kid who needs speech therapy. There might be a kid who needs 5 other kinds of therapies. And so the cost is not the same and the services aren't the same. And so that makes it a little bit complicated as well. So they're trying to figure out make recommendations for a better and smoother way to do it, it's pretty complicated, but and we're glad we're not the ones making those decisions. But that's a little bit of the background on that discussion as well.
Yeah. Another official recommendation is ensuring that charters and kind of non-traditional public school options, specialty schools are also held harmless. And we're going to talk more in depth on what hold harmless means a little bit later. But this just ensures that those schools will not receive less funding as a result of all the reshuffling of funds that this formula does. They're not going to see some unexpected drop of funds because maybe they're losing dollars when another district or another school's gaining dollars. So it's just kind of including them in the bucket. All districts are already held harmless, so it's including those other schools in that as well. And then the last part is just streamlining reports and data. And this is something we've heard from any person we talk to that's a district CFO has told us, like, reporting, budgeting, all this stuff, it's on this really wacky schedule. You might do a budget and then 2 weeks later you might get additional numbers. You have to do another budget, or you have to do another report at a time.
You submit your budget at the end of the year, right? The fiscal year, but you don't even know how much money you're getting quite yet. So you have to guesstimate, and you see a lot of that happening. So they want to align the budgets and align the timelines to the budgets and to other timelines for getting data. And so it's just a streamline, an efficiency that I think everybody should and can and does support, because we see a lot of people, deadlines, without the information that they need. And then they have to go back and correct that. And then they go back to the board. Have you seen the meetings, like, oh, now we have the actual numbers and there's these little changes. And so they're streamlining that, streamlining when certain reports are due for evaluations, for educators, as well as a budgeting for how much certain evaluations cost and so forth. So it's a little bit of just a kind of common sense, something that everybody's always wanted to work out. They put it in here, and that's something that hopefully should be a lot more, make it a lot more manageable for those and for the district.
And again, these are legislative changes. So it will, although they're recommending it, doesn't mean it's going to happen. The legislature still needs to work these things out. These have been submitted to the governor's office and Legislative Committee on Education, Department of Ed. So a lot of folks have gotten these recommendations. We don't know how that's going to translate in session. But for the most part, these are really positive steps and kind of working out some technical things. And really that has been the story of the past year of this commission, is working out a lot of technical issues. Some of them haven't been worked out. There's still a lot of debate on certain things, but what they were tasked with was really standing up this formula side by side with how we do funding now, and seeing kind of, are there any glitches? Are there things that happen that were unexpected? Are there things that we could do better? So they've really worked out a lot of those technical issues. And that's in large part how they came up with some of these recommendations is, yeah, these are things that are outside the scope of what we can do as a commission. We really need the legislature to act on these issues.
Yeah, and so to summarize their recommendations, they recommended that they're going to define that risk. They haven't defined it yet, but that is a recommendation to define it. They're accounting for special education, how they're going to budget for that or fund it separately. The hold harmless, that they're going to include the charters and other unique type schools, because it was just an oversight and they just didn't include them when they wrote the bill. So they just made sure that they're included in there. And streamlining the reports and deadlines. So that's a lot of the recommendations that they do have so far.
So what haven't they done? The stuff that we've been like drooling at the mouth for, the stuff that we've been really wanting. So big undecided issues that are kind of they're within the purview of the commission. It's their obligation to do this, but they just haven't done it yet. Recommending an optimal funding target. This is probably one of the most critical things they can do. Like everyone knows, yeah, you can reshuffle those, chairs on the Titanic as much as you want. You really need to keep this boat afloat. And that's what these targets do. What do students need and how do we get them there? The commission is tasked with those two things. So they're just now getting to that. And I think a lot of ways they felt like they had to work out the technical things first, but this is really kind of the most critical thing that they need to be doing. And this is what they're working on probably the past couple months and for the next few months and maybe even for the next few years, I hope not. So optimal funding, it's a really new term. It's not really something you see in other states. Most other states use sufficient or adequate, kind of these standard terms. Optimal is kind of this new term. So one of the things the commission needs to do first off is define it. What does optimal mean? Once they've figured that out, like what do we determine is an optimal education, or what does that mean? Then they have to cost out the resources to get to that target. And then finally,
All means like every student gets scores, should score this on their ACT, should have this or that, and how much does it cost, right? But they don't know, what that optimal is. Um,
yeah, it's complicated because it's a little abstract. It's something that's abstract that needs to be drilled down to a very specific dollar figure. So there's kind of a long walk between those things. So they're just starting to have those discussions. Once they come up with that target, or hopefully before then, they'll start proposing kind of the next stage, which is a 10-year plan to reach the target. This can include pulling funds from somewhere else in the budget to meet the target. But let's be real, it's really going to require additional revenue. There's no way that you're going to come up with, $1.5 billion by shuffling funds. We have a really lean state budget. That's just not going to happen. You're not going to find enough insufficiency, or what's the word, inefficiencies, to kind of make up for that deficit. So they have to come up with a plan to reach the target. Really promising. I mean, it's complicated. It's going to take a long time, might even require another study, but we're really encouraged by the way they're approaching it. They've decided to create benchmarks along the 10-year path.
so like
And
goals or
like
target.
goals.
Yeah.
And the first goal is restoration of funds. This last special session, public education lost $160 million just because of the economic crisis that we're in, lost some really important programs, or at least funding for those programs. So the first benchmark is, let's restore those programs. Let's restore those dollars. So SB 178, Read by Grade 3, teacher incentives. There's all these other things that were funded, all those programs.
Before this recession at the bare minimum.
Yeah. So that's a good first step, right? That's let's restore. Let's not start in the negative. Let's start kind of where we, at zero at least. So that's the first benchmark. So that's something we can already start working towards. We know what the benchmark is, even though we don't know what optimal funding is. We know what that benchmark is. The second benchmark is adequacy. And this is something that we really are encouraged by. It's something that we really had hoped for. Adequacy is defined by our state's own study. We commissioned a study by a group called Augenblick. They went around to all the districts, talked to educators, administrators, district officials, and asked them a simple question. What does it take? What do you need to get every student the opportunity to meet state standards? What does it take? And they did interviews. They talked to so many folks. And then they looked at evidence-based practices in other states. So they really kind of did this holistic study of, what does it take to get our students across the finish line, meeting our state standards. We require students to do a lot. We require them to meet a lot of benchmarks. What do they need to actually get there? So they did this study. The most recent update to it was 2018. So it's not an old study. It's fairly new. It's a widely accepted method of determining adequacy. A lot of other states have used this to set funding goals or funding targets, or they even made it part of their funding formulas. And why we really like it is, it likely guides the legislature on what they need to be constitutionally compliant. Typically in states with adequacy studies like the one that our parents have brought, that standard, what do students need to meet state standards, that's typically the standard that courts use. So we think it's a really important benchmark, and we think it's really going to be informative to legislators. So we're really excited to see that as kind of the second benchmark towards optimal funding.
And so what adequacy does, rather than, people hear a number, right? Like this is, the big number, but it really tells you like, this is what the student to teacher ratio should be. This is depending on an elementary with this many students or this much enrollment. This is how many counselors or social workers they should be funded. This is how many nurses they should have. This is how many aides they should have, facilitators. They even cost out, the professional development days for teachers. electives. So they said, like, how much does all of that cost to be effective, right? So that doesn't mean that you have to have those resources. Let's say we are adequate and we have that funding, doesn't mean that the school has to have that per se, but it funds these things that were determined, talking to educators, to principals, also using, national data and research to say, like, oh, this is what would make a school whole and give the students the resources that they need. So it's a guide. It's not just a number out of thin air. It's actual factual, like, you know, data that you can count on.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, it's cost based. What we've been asking for this whole time is let's have our formula, let's have our funding rooted in something that's real, not just arbitrary funding, not just based on what we have, available at the time. Let's actually shoot for a target that makes sense. It's logical. So we're really excited that they're doing this. Um,
To kind of summarize a little bit, so that big goal, one of the big goals of the commission, the one that is really important to us, is the funding, right? So like they want to say, like, so okay, how much funding do we need, right? And so that was the goal, and they said, what is optimal? That's, they have to define what optimal is. They have not, but they have these two benchmarks or goals. Okay, we're going to restore all the funds that we just cut this past summer, and then adequacy is going to be one of the benchmarks. And we do know how much that is, and we actually have a number for that. So that's already one goal. And what makes us so excited about that is that, you know, even though we don't have optimal and we might need another study to define what optimal is, we already know an amount that we can start working towards and that they can build a revenue plan around. So that's why we're really, really excited about that. And because it's proven, lots of states use it. We've talked about it, we've seen it, we're familiar with it. And when we talk to principals and educators and teachers and explain, what it is that adequacy supports, what resources, it really sits in line to what they hope that we have. And we talk to a principal and, like, oh, this is what it recommends. They don't have anything near that. It's just like, and this isn't pie in the sky, this is factual. This is something, this is a number we can get to, and you can then have those resources, or whatever resources your specific school or district determines you need.
And it actually kind of, if we were to fund at adequacy levels, it would put us pretty much in the middle of the pack in funding in the country. So it's not going to put us, we're not going to be Massachusetts, we're not spending 20,000 per pupil or something like that, but it'll put us at least kind of in the middle instead of us always being, number 47, 48. So we really think it's a good benchmark. It's still, north of $1 billion to get there. So it's a long road ahead. But let's at least shoot for something that's actually, rational, versus kind of what we've been doing in the past. And as
sounds scary, but as a reminder, as Amanda said, that's just the average, right? So the average is about the average of what the country has, and I think our students deserve at least that.
We're just really far behind. And so the next part of that, and this is something that we'll be pushing for, and we hope folks come out and push for, is the commission to develop a revenue plan or start that process with these two targets in mind, and not waiting until they've come up with an optimal funding target, whatever that might be, not waiting till that happens before we start developing a revenue plan and moving towards that. We have a legislative session that's 2 months away. This is an opportunity to educate lawmakers on the plan, maybe start getting some movement on some of the issues. I have a daughter in 3rd grade. I don't want her to be in junior high or high school before we even start working on this plan. This is something that, we need to do now. Our students need it now. So we've been pushing the commission to say, okay, you got these benchmarks and they're already pretty lofty. Let's start developing a revenue plans. These would be recommendations on additional revenue, recommendations on changes to current revenue structures and things like that, or just, adjusting for inefficiencies in the system and all these other things. And there's a lot of ways to start, chipping away to get to that target. So we really want the commission, and are hoping the commission will provide some recommendations for us to kind of run with at the legislative session.
Right. So I summarize it like this, and this helps me remember it. So what we want them to define the funding. So funding, develop a plan, right? What is their revenue plan? So they have 10 years they have to build a plan to say, how do we get there in 10 years? and then the recommendations to the legislature, which ultimately decides, like, oh yes, we're going to adopt this. Oh, you made these recommendations for how to build revenue. We will or we won't do it, right? So, and I remembered FDR. So, like, right, FDR's New Deal. So I call it our new our new funding formula. But we want the funding, we want them to develop the plan, and we want those recommendations. And it's around the corner, right? The legislative session starts February 1st, and so we're really hoping that they're able to put that together. We're realistic. We know that we're not going to, all of a sudden have all this funding, especially with everything that's going on, but we can have a plan. And not having a plan is part of why we're kind of in the situation that we are now, one of the states most highly impacted by this recession. And so we really do need to get a plan going, and we're comfortable or confident that that's something that we can start.
Mhm. Absolutely. So kind of the last thing we're going to talk about, or the last kind of substantive part of this is, you know, how does the pandemic, or how does this recession and budget crises affect the work of the commission, affect implementation of the formula? Um, and, just FYI, this coming commission meeting on Friday, they will be discussing that. Are they going to make an official recommendation to delay implementation of the formula, given the challenges of a loss of funds? And we've always said this formula only works with additional dollars. So now we're kind of seeing, well, what happens when dollars are taken away? Is it untenable? Can you not actually implement the formula? So they'll be discussing that this Friday at the commission meeting. And I imagine there'll be a lot of public comment of folks going one way or the other on this. It'll be interesting to see what the commission does. But I think that the economic crisis has really laid bare some of the fundamental flaws with the formula itself. And these are things that we had talked quite a bit about with lawmakers during the last session. And they're just kind of exacerbated by what's happening with the budget crises. So I'm going to talk about two different issues. The first one is the hold harmless. I said that we would revisit the hold harmless. It's complicated. I'm going to tell you right up front, we could do an entire 1 hour section on the hold harmless. I'm going to try to keep it simple, but it's a really critical thing. SB 543 had a provision in it that states the legislative intent to not provide districts any fewer dollars than they were receiving in the 2019-2020 school year. Like we said, this formula is largely about reshuffling dollars between districts. So obviously, if you have dollars go from one district to another, you're going to see funding not available for that district. So there was a commitment to not provide any funding below the 2020 levels. And the way that the commission is recommending this be implemented, there'd be about 10 districts that fall under hold harmless.
Hold harmless, it basically freezes your funds.
Mhm.
And so you're not going to get more funds for a certain amount of time, some a few years, some more years, like, so some for maybe 3 years, some districts for maybe 10 years. But basically, it's like you're not going to get a raise for a certain amount of time. Right. And, but the hold harmless means you're not going to get less money. So they're holding you harmless from making less, but you're not going to get more. So, like,
Yeah,
just
so imagine if you had a job for 10 years and you never get a raise, no cost of living adjustments, no raises, but all of your expenses around you are going up. Your rent is going up, the cost of food's going up, the cost of, fuel's going up, but you're stuck at the same amount. So your dollar's going to go, less far every single year. So that's really the situation that a lot of districts are being put into. Just because this formula is really a reshuffling of funds, it's not really adding any new dollars to the system.
And that's
So
what they're calling hold harmless, is the freeze, right? Like, you're not going to make less. But one of our concerns is, as Amanda was talking about earlier, was the 2019-2020 hold harmless at the funds, right? So they did not cut any of the base funding for the districts, which was really helpful. And it's something that the districts wanted. Our concern is that we are going to come back this session and there might be cuts to the district. So if you've been a long-time state employee, you remember the furloughs, like, oh, so now you're going to make, 10% less, or whatever it is, you're going to make less. So on top of being a district, or who's not going to get any funds, who's going to have funds frozen for several years. The fear is, not only are they going to be frozen, they're going to ask you to take a step back because we're going to have cuts, and then freeze you at that rate. So not only are you not getting a raise, you're actually going to take a pay cut, and then you're going to get frozen at that. And so we're hoping at the minimum that they honor that funding or that hold harmless at the rate that at this year's rate, as opposed to what may be coming, which may be cuts, because that's just detrimental.
And I think an important thing that's kind of lost in this discussion, and that when we talked to legislators last session, they didn't quite understand is, according to the state's own study, 15 out of our 17 districts are currently inadequately funded. So it's not like we're freezing funding in districts that, have golden toilets in their bathrooms. These aren't districts with a lot of money. These are districts that are currently struggling with funding. So now they're going to be frozen, and that has real consequences. There's going to be losses of programs. There's going to be loss of educators. There's, class sizes will
For
go
the
up.
years these districts are frozen, those teachers are not going to get raises. They might leave, not no new books. There's not money for anything additional. And things deteriorate. Technology deteriorates. I think the lifespan for a laptop, that students use, we know how rough students are, is about 4 years, right? So you're not going to be able to replace that. You're not going to get additional funding. You're going to have to make do with what you have. And we all know how inflation works if that was our household. So that's a really big challenge. And
And and what's interesting with districts, usual inflation is like 1.5%, 2%, but the specific types of expenses that districts have actually is closer to 4 or 5%. So it's kind of like a 5% reduction in funds year to year. So it's really problematic. And one of the, I think Michelle already mentioned, we talked about that restoration funding target, to bring back that 160 million lost during session. We want at the very least for the 2020 funding levels to be included in that restoration target. So if there is a loss of funds, districts won't be frozen at that budget crises level. They'll at least be able to be restored to the 2020 levels, before they're frozen. But kind of our second issue is the fundamental flaw with being frozen for 1, 2, 10 years, while your costs are going up, or even your enrollment might go up. You don't get any adjustments for that. There has to be a better way. And we had found a better way. We had examined formulas across the country, and Illinois has a really great formula. They just modernized their formula. I'd argue that they probably did a little bit better job than we did, but that's okay. We're going to get there. But one of the things that they did is similar hold harmless. You won't receive any fewer dollars than you did the year the formula was implemented. But as additional revenue is entered into the stream of funds, each district will get some additional revenue based on their distance from their own district's adequacy targets. So we talked about those adequacy targets. So each district is going to have a unique target, right? Because there's cost adjustment factors, there's things like that. So Clark County might be really far away from being adequately funded. So they would get the lion's share of additional revenue, but it doesn't leave these other districts that are currently inadequately funded, high and dry. They would receive a proportional amount of additional revenue. So it kind of keeps everyone invested in the formula. No one's getting stuck at inadequate levels with no movement. And it's just kind of a more fair and equitable way to do it. I'm sorry, Michelle, I see
I'm
you
going to
want to.
explain a little bit. So I'm going to explain a little bit about why we even have that in the first place. Like, why are we freezing anybody? So what the plan kind of does is it says, okay, you have the least amount of money, so we're going to give all the money to this district, which is why we're freezing. So any additional funds, we're going to give to this district that has the least amount, per their data. And you're not going to get anything until this district is whole, or where we want it to be, and then you get something. So that's why they're kind of having to wait for years, and that's the point of the freezing of funds for some districts. They did do an enrollment adjustment, which what it does is it says like, let's take Clark County School District, for example, right? They have like Mesquite, or certain areas within their district that are different, right? So they adjusted for that. And so what we had is, I believe, what, 13, no,
Are you talking
13,
about the attendance area adjustment, the attendance zones? Yeah, so
yeah,
it's not necessarily an enrollment adjustment, but it kind of divides districts up into a few more different sections, kind of recognizing, like, if you're an ELCO, there's certain parts of ELCO that are kind of their own little district, and other parts, and they have different costs. And I think you bring up something that we kind of didn't fundamentally talk about is, different places have different types of expenses. So A rural county is going to need a lot more funding for transportation and might need additional dollars to maintain schools because you're kind of, you don't have the economies of scale or a bunch of different students to kind of spread the cost out. Other districts might have different challenges. So it's every district costs a little bit differently to operate. $5,000 in one district is not going to go as far as $5,000 in another. So that's why these adjustments exist. And that's part of the technical stuff that the commission's been doing is what are those wage adjustments? What does it cost to have a teacher in this county versus this county? What are those transportation differences? So that's how they've kind of come up with that's the reshuffling. We keep saying reshuffling of funds, but that's fundamentally what it is.
Yeah.
So
You
they're
know, the
reshuffled now.
enrollment too. So if you have an increase in enrollment and you're one of these districts, well, basically you're not going to, that is
Yeah.
frozen, you're not going to get any more money. So you just kind of have to spread the funding amongst the new students. And so that's an issue that we had since the beginning of the session. We wish that they had included an enrollment adjustment, and they didn't do an enrollment adjustment. So for any districts that who are frozen and have an increase in enrollment, on top of dealing with the inflation that they're not going to get more money for, they're also not going to get more money for the additional students. I'm going to take this opportunity really quick to just explain a little bit, because I'm always hearing, or we're always hearing, oh, these rural districts, they get more per pupil than somebody like CCSD. And so just really quick, like so let's take the superintendent CCSD. He makes about 320 or so thousand a year, right? Makes it's a tough job. But that's about $1 per pupil, right? There's about 320,000 students. So that's about $1 per pupil. You take another district, a rural district that has, 20,000 students,
Yeah.
and let's say you give $1 per pupil to the superintendent. Now you're paying a superintendent $20,000. And that's why the rural areas or some smaller districts might require more funding because of the economies of scale, right? A large district like CCSD can buy, 100,000 books at $1 or whatever rate they get, whereas a small district is only going to need 100 and they're not going to get the same rate. And so that's a little bit just thought I'd throw that in there because we hear that a lot, people just kind of not understanding economies of scale. So you might be getting more money per pupil. That doesn't necessarily mean you have more or better services. Another issue that we hear from rurals a lot is that they have to pay their teachers a lot more to come there because there's districts that are like an hour and a half away from the nearest place where you could go get a haircut. I don't know about you guys, but you'd have to pay me pretty good money for me to move somewhere like that. And that's what they have to do, right? So they have just higher recruitment costs on top of that and retention costs. There's just a little bit of some of the differences that between the
Yeah.
larger urban versus rural districts.
Yeah, and a lot of the issues with the old Nevada plan is folks felt like the way that the costs were adjusted between districts favored small or rural counties a little bit too much. So a lot of the work of the commission is readjusting that. So, they're not finding wide variations that, oh, the old formula was completely off. In fact, that old formula is pretty equitable, but it has, adjusted things a little bit and drawn more funding to Clark County and some other counties. So that's why we're seeing the reshuffling of funds. But it's, at this point, I always heard that old argument that rurals just get way too much funds. We got to put that to bed because now with the new formula, there's kind of wide consensus that, okay, now the formula makes sense. Still doesn't mean that, 15 out of 17 of our districts are underfunded. That's still the reality. So we need to kind of have that in mind when we're
17
talking about
are
building.
considered have inadequate funds
Mhm.
for the studies that we have. So basically what our proposal, right, and what Illinois does is instead of saying, okay, you get all the money's going to go to this one district that needs it the most, and then you're going to have to wait your turn, right? So you're going to get the same amount. I know you're also hungry, but you're just not going to get any more until this person's whole. What it does is saying, okay, you're the hungriest, if you will. So you're going to get the majority, but you're all still going to get something proportionate to how far away you are from where you need to be. So that way, maybe you're not getting what you'd wanted. You're not getting the larger amount that some of the school districts have, the needier school districts, if you will, but you're still getting something. And I think that helps. It's more palatable to some of the rural areas. So we've definitely seen some of the school districts and even students that have actually spoken at these meetings and saying like, hey, this isn't going to be good. This is going to hurt us. And so maybe that's something that won't have such a negative effect on their school districts.
Yeah. So that's hold harmless. We told you it was complicated. But if you have any questions on it, we're happy to come back and do a whole session on it. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but it's really important. And it's really important as we grow into this new formula, to have something that really gets the whole state invested, on adequately funding our schools, and I think that the Illinois model really does that. So I think we've covered that to death. The second
I
issue,
think we've confused everybody perfectly. I think
yeah,
everybody else is like, what?
if you're
So,
still
okay,
awake.
moving on.
The second issue that's really been laid bare, the problem that's really kind of come out and been exacerbated by the budget crisis, is the transition to weights. Yes, we do want us to move to weighted funding. It's about time. Our state needs to do that. But we had major concerns because what essentially is going to happen is funding that supports those categorical programs, Zoom and Victory Schools and formerly SB 178 dollars, we're going to be transitioned into a weight. So you're going to have a pot of funds that only funded about 20% of the population being spread thin to the 100% of the population that qualifies, that is at risk or English learner. That's difficult to do, right? Because those Zoom and Victory schools are going to lose essential resources. And a lot of their success has really been built around having reading centers and after school programs and things like that. A lot of that would go away. There just wouldn't be the funding available. And I think lawmakers, for the most part, understood that. And they did provide for a 2-year period where districts could maintain Zoom and Victory schools. So for the coming biennium, even if we transition to weights, a district could say like, look, we don't have enough funding to really kind of drill those dollars down to each individual school. So we're going to maintain these programs at these high needs schools. That's great, but now we find ourselves in a horrible budget crisis. We have lost SB 178 dollars. Those dollars are gone. If your school still was able to maintain those programs, that was done through some creative accounting and use of federal dollars, but those state dollars are gone. So now you have even less funding to support those weights. And that's problematic. We don't want the
math actually. So right now through SB 178, through Victory and Zoom schools, we're only serving 20% of unique needs students. Um, so just imagine you take funding that serves 20% of students and it serves them well, and we've seen great results from that, and you spread it among the rest of the students. It's not going to be enough to have an effect on those students. And it's really going to hurt those students who were at those Zoom and Victory, right, who were getting that amount of money. Yeah, so it's really a lose-lose. However, we, and just be, a little background, because we do hear in the community, oh, don't cancel Zoom and Victory, so they're not understanding weights. But again, and as we talked about earlier, weights are important because they help every student who is considered at risk or EL, or gifted and talented. It gives all of them money. Right now, if you go to a Zoom or Victory school, you're a lucky student because you're getting those services. But if you are an EL kid who is not at a Zoom or Victory school, you're not getting anything. Again, it shouldn't be about luck. Weights does that. You guys call it, a lot of people call it, money follows the student. It does that, right? Kind of like you are the student who needs that additional funding, and you're going to get that funding. It doesn't matter what school you're at. And that's why weights are important. Zoom and Victory schools do great things. And we hope that when we do effectively, in a proper way, transition to weights, that we can learn from those schools and see what they did to get the great results that they did. And that those students, let's say you're an at-risk student at a Zoom school, well, you weren't getting services anyway because you're not considered EL, right? So now all students who have the needs will be getting the additional resources that they need.
Yeah, so our recommendation is really simple. We don't have to rush into this. We don't have to, take away the discretion to maintain Zoom and Victory schools. We don't need to, send those dollars directly to each individual school based on the students. That doesn't have to happen prematurely, because like we said, it's a lose-lose. It's not going to really help the students outside Zoom and Victory because it's going to be such a small amount of funding, and it's going to decimate those programs. So it's not complicated. Let's just wait until we have the funding available to responsibly transition. We probably won't be able to do that right away. And even when we transition, there's probably going to be more to be desired, in funding those weights. But we just don't see a way to actually do that without some investments. We were, pre-pandemic, we were hoping that there'd be a commitment to start funding those weights over the next 2 years. So when, districts don't have the discretion and these funds do need to go down to each individual school, we would have enough funds to kind of make that work. That doesn't seem very likely based on what's happened over the past 7-8 months. So weights are great. We support that. We just don't think the timing's right to do that.
So, and you'll hear, we've heard a lot in public comment, like, halt the formula, just wait, the recession, just, wait. There's some really great parts about the formula. And it's long overdue. We talked about the transparency. We talked about, the adequacy. We talked about building a plan. There's some really great parts. And we really do think that, it's time that we move forward with something new. Our students deserve it. Maybe there's just certain components of the formula that we need to just wait to make sure that we can do it responsibly. And so that we don't hurt any students. And so that's kind of what us at ENN, what we're advocating for. Some of that hold harmless was just because it's a fundamental flaw in the formula, but then also the recession has, amplified some of the issues with that, especially with the transition to weights and the hold harmless at the level of the school year. So, it doesn't mean you need to throw out the whole thing, right? Let's take what works and work on what doesn't work and, get to a point where we can do it responsibly.
Absolutely. So we only have a few minutes left. So I guess we'll kind of close out. We talked a lot. And, just kind of let folks know that, regardless of the commission, all these other things that are happening, really it's going to take holding our legislators accountable to really start, making positive change for our public schools. There's so many ways to participate. And I think, one of the, if there are any bright sides to this crisis, this pandemic, it's that there's even more ways for people to more directly participate. A lot of folks couldn't fly up to Carson City or maybe couldn't make it down to the Grant Sawyer building to testify during the legislative session. Now you can call in. You've always been able to write in public comment. And some people ask us like, well, I'm kind of nervous to do that. I don't really know what to say. Tell your story. I mean, it's really simple. If you're in a school and, I have a daughter last year, her second grade class had 31 students. That's just not right. And it was a really difficult situation and she didn't get those personal stories are really what lawmakers need to hear, and just beat the drum. Like, we need a plan. We need to start moving towards appropriately funding our schools. I don't want my child to be in college by the time we actually start doing anything about this. And they really, I've heard them say over and over again, a lot of lawmakers are, yeah, we hear from lobbyists and special interest groups all the time, but what really perks them up and gets their attention is regular constituents, parents, families, just people from the community, telling them how they feel. If you took the time to let your lawmaker know how you feel, that means so much more than any lobbyist walking into their room. So I really encourage folks to be engaged. Sign up for our newsletters. We'll provide a link to a pledge that'll kind of keep you in the know. We'll let you know when committee hearings are happening, really opportune times to testify, talking points, kind of knowing what's happening. We're happy to provide that. And then public comment during these commission meetings. They're really starting to get to the good, juicy stuff. So it's the best time. You've got all the technical stuff, I wouldn't say all of it, but a lot of it's done. Now they're really talking about the really critical piece, which is, which I thought was great to hear students come out and say, hey, these are the challenges my school faces in my county. Can you make sure that, we aren't devastated by this new formula, or can you make sure that we have a plan going forward? So it's really important to have those personal stories.
Yeah, and you don't have to feel overwhelmed by this last hour. If you're a parent or a community member who's just jumping on and isn't familiar with all this terminology, again, just tell your story. You are obviously here because you want more for your kid or for your school, or you're an educator and you want more for your students. Whatever it is, it's important to you. And so again, it's just the stories. You don't have to understand a lot of this. You can sign up for a newsletter, and we tried our best to explain everything. We're going to do more of these if people like them. We also will take requests if you guys want us to explain anything a little bit better. If you stay tuned on our Facebook page, and we'll be posting them up later online, just graphics that kind of explain this as best as possible in the simplest way that we could think of. So, but the big deal is just saying, look, we are towards the bottom in funding. Our achievement's also towards the bottom. We've known this. We know we have issues. in our education system. We also know we're facing a recession, but we also know we don't have a plan. And last recession, all we did was cut funding. We cut taxes, and some of them were never even restored. And now we're in a position where we don't even have anywhere to cut except critical resources in the classroom. We're really scared to know what's going to happen this legislative session. And so, at the very least, because the first benchmark is to restore funds, we need to get out there as a whole and tell them you cannot cut funds from K-12. It is important. The more we hear about the need to diversify the economy and all of this stuff, it all is rooted in education, right? So it's that important. We understand that there are a lot of issues, but I mean, nothing is as important as our K-12 and the resources that our students need. And we learned a lot from this pandemic. Our schools provide more than just an education. They provided food. They provide wraparound resources. It's where students went and saw dentists. They got their vision checked. They got, counseling services. It was a lot more than just academics. And so our schools are really the backbone of what we're finding this whole country, but especially Las Vegas. So you can see it in all the debates that you find on social media. It's that important, and it's that important that we preserve it and grow it.
Absolutely. So do we have any questions? I don't know if you're able, I couldn't get the chat to open up on my phone, so I don't know.
I don't, I think we touched on a lot of them.
Mhm.
And yes, we talk a lot to parents because we get a lot of, input from parents, but we have a lot of community members who are also here and advocating. And we really thank everybody who is involved and who sat through this for an hour. So,
Sorry.
yeah, so you can see there, we did put on Facebook in the comment section, we put a link so you could sign a pledge. If you sign the pledge, you just get our newsletter. Otherwise, you could just go to educatenevadanow.com, which is our website, and just sign up for our newsletter and get involved. And so we'll again do our best to simplify it. When there's a big meeting coming up, we'll alert people. And a lot of you guys got here through the CCSD parents page or some other Facebook page or wherever it is that you're getting the information. And stay tuned, just keep at it. How we got here and how we're having this discussion is because the community demanded that we redo the funding formula, and it happened not exactly how we wanted to, as we just discussed for the last hour, but we're getting there, and your voices really matter. It sounds so cliche, but when you see the faces of legislators and you got parent after parent after parent after parent and community member and educator and student talking about the issues, and I mean, it really makes an impact. So thank you all for being here and putting up with us for the last hour. We hope we did, that there's a little bit more clarity about what this commission is, why it's important, and why the key is going to be at the legislators, because they have the ultimate authority to even adopt these recommendations.
And let us know if there's another thing you want to hear more about. So, let's say we mentioned the litigation. We didn't really go into it in depth, but if you want to learn, we're happy to do some more sessions on specific issues. So if you watch this whole thing, you're like, oh, I didn't really want, I wanted to learn more about this. I didn't hear about it. Let us know, shoot us an email. We'd love to come back and talk about it.
Yes, and if you have a group that you want us to speak to as well, we do that often. Whether it's just a group of friends, or you're part of an organization or a leadership group or class or anything, we love it. This is what we do. We geek out and talk education funding in the simplest way we know how. Also, any recommendations for simplifying something where you're like, y'all talked over our heads, we want to hear it so that we can explain things better.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all. I don't see any questions. Again, thank you all. This is obviously gonna be recorded on Facebook, but we also are gonna put this up on our website for anybody that doesn't have social media so that they can view this and refer back to it. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.